This story is based on a true event that happened in the soul-chilling, freezing mountains of the Andes, located between the borders of Chile and Argentina. In the footage, 45 young people are seen standing in front of an airplane, bright smiles lighting up every face. None of them had the slightest idea that this photo would become the last picture of their lives. Just 13 minutes later, this terrifying plane would slam into a snow-covered mountain at nearly 4,000 meters high. The impact would be so violent that the aircraft would break into two pieces, and screams would echo through the snow and fog. When the smoke cleared, only 27 out of the 45 people would still be alive. But soon, these 27 survivors would realize that those who died in the crash were perhaps the luckiest ones, because the price of staying alive would force them to do one of the most painful and difficult things in human history. Welcome to another explosive video from Flick Movies. This story begins on the morning of October 12th, 1972. The place was Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. Members of a rugby team were gathering there. They were headed to Santiago, Chile, to play a friendly match. But it wasn't just the players on the plane. Family members, friends, and some supporters were also coming along. The atmosphere was lighthearted and full of joy. For most people, it was just a simple match and a short trip. For a guy named Numa, though, it felt a little different. He was about to graduate from college, and his 5 friends had convinced him again and again to join the trip because after graduation, everyone would go their separate ways. Maybe this was the last chance for all the friends to spend time together. The team captain, Marcelo, carefully called out everyone's names and counted them to make sure no one was left behind. Then all 45 people stood together and took a group photo before boarding the plane. Family members stood at a distance, waving goodbye. Shortly after, the plane took off. Sunlight was shining brightly above the aircraft, and everything looked completely normal and full of hope. No one imagined that this photo would later become a painful memory in history. For a while, the plane flew smoothly. Then it started approaching the Andes Mountains. The view outside the windows was spectacular but dangerous. Snow-covered high peaks peeked through the clouds. Sunlight reflecting off the glaciers was so intense it could blind you. This is the longest mountain range in the world, with an average height of over 4,000 meters and many peaks rising above 6,000 meters. But the young people inside the plane weren't thinking about the dangers. No one realized that danger was slowly closing in on them. Suddenly, the plane shook hard, jolted, and wobbled slightly. A passenger named Roy grabbed the seat handle in panic. He wasn't a team player but had joined at a friend's invitation. It was his first time flying over the Andes. Soon the shaking got worse. The pilot's voice came over the loudspeaker, telling everyone to fasten their seatbelts. He also announced they would be landing in Santiago in just a few minutes. But within minutes, the plane's condition changed. The jolts became stronger and stronger. It no longer felt like a joke. It felt like the aircraft was losing control. In the cockpit, the pilot made a fatal mistake. He thought the plane had already crossed the main ridge of the Andes. He was sure the most dangerous part was behind them, so he decided to descend and prepare for landing in Santiago. But this was before GPS existed. Pilots had no precise way of knowing their exact position. They had to rely on weak radio signals to guess how far they had come. The pilot believed the plane had cleared the mountains, but in reality, it was still surrounded by high peaks. Once he started descending, pulling the plane back up became almost impossible. Seconds later, a massive white mountain suddenly appeared through the clouds. The pilot pulled back on the controls with all his strength. The engines roared, but it was too late. The altitude was too low, the speed was too slow, and the mountain was too close. In that instant, the pilot realized his terrible mistake. At 4,000 meters in the Andes, even a small error is a death sentence. There is no second chance. Then it happened. There was a tremendous crash. The rear of the plane broke off, and the front section began sliding across the snow like a heavy object being dragged over ice. It carved a long trench in the snow as it moved forward. Seats inside were ripped out and shattered. Luggage flew everywhere. Screams and the screech of tearing metal echoed together. The entire crash lasted less than a minute. But that 1 minute changed the fate of 45 people forever. When the plane finally stopped sliding, a deathly silence fell. Some people had died instantly in the impact, their bodies badly broken. Others were severely injured and lay screaming in pain. Some were unconscious, and some were completely missing, perhaps thrown out during the crash and now lost somewhere in the snowy mountains. The survivors slowly tried to free themselves from their seats. They staggered to their feet and looked around. The scene in front of them was like a nightmare. Someone suggested checking the cockpit. If the pilot was still alive, maybe the radio still worked and they could call for help. A few people struggled forward to the cockpit. There they found the pilot still breathing faintly. He was dying. With gestures, he told them to try sending a message on the radio. But when they tried, they discovered the radio was broken and not working. The pilot was struggling to breathe. Finally, with his last bit of strength, he whispered, "God be with you." And then his breathing stopped forever. At that moment, all the survivors understood that they would now have to save themselves. Evening came quickly. At nearly 4,000 meters in the Andes, the temperature drops dramatically after sunset. Within just 1 or 2 hours, the mild daytime warmth can plunge to -30 degrees Celsius or even lower. The survivors huddled together inside the broken fuselage. They tried to block the torn sections with seat cushions and suitcases to stop the freezing wind from coming in. But it wasn't enough. They didn't have enough warm clothes, sleeping bags, or any way to make a fire, because they had expected to reach warm, safe Santiago in just a few hours. The biggest problem was that many were seriously injured. Their bodies were cooling down even faster because of heavy blood loss. In the darkness, Captain Marcelo's voice could be heard. He kept calling out to everyone, telling them not to fall asleep because they could die from the cold. He repeatedly called their names to keep them awake and their bodies warm. But that night, 3 more people stopped breathing. They had survived the terrible plane crash, but couldn't survive the cold of the first night. When the first rays of sunlight entered the broken fuselage the next morning, Roy took a deep breath. He was still alive. Slowly, the others began coming out. The gentle morning sunlight brought a little warmth. In that light, for the first time, everyone clearly saw where they were trapped. They were deep inside the Andes at about 4,000 meters. All around them were endless snow-covered peaks. Sunlight created a cold sparkle on the snow. There were no trees, no plants, no sign of life. They were completely stranded in a white, snowy desert, cut off from the rest of the world. The initial count showed that at least 12 out of 45 had died in the crash, including crew members and several passengers. 29 people were still alive, but most were injured. Some were still missing. Perhaps they had fallen into a valley with a broken tail or were buried under the snow. Captain Marcelo took a deep breath and made a decision. They needed to create more space inside the fuselage. Some seats had to be removed, so everyone could huddle together at night. The injured would get space first. Everyone got to work. They removed seats with trembling hands, whether from the cold or from fear. No one could tell. Marcelo kept everyone together. He knew that in such dire situations, panic is more dangerous than the cold itself. So he gave everyone different tasks. It wasn't just to get the work done, it was also to give each person a reason to keep living. During this time, someone quietly asked what they should do with the bodies of those who had died. Marcelo looked at the stiffened bodies, stayed silent for a few moments, and then said, "Keep them to one side. We'll decide when the rescue team arrives." Behind those words was a hope no one wanted to talk about openly. They all believed help would come soon, and this nightmare would end quickly. Then Marcelo started distributing the remaining food. There were a few small bottles of wine, some chocolate, and a few packets of biscuits. No one knew how many days this would last, but since they still had something to eat, they felt a little hopeful. But this hope wouldn't last long. At that moment, they heard the sound of an engine in the distance. All the survivors suddenly got excited. They thought a rescue plane had arrived, but no aircraft appeared in the sky. The sound echoed between the mountains, gradually faded, and finally disappeared completely. The next day, it became clear to everyone. If they didn't find a way to keep the inside of the fuselage warmer, they would die one by one from the cold. So they got back to work. They searched for clothes, jackets, and anything that could block the wind, and stuffed them into the broken sections of the plane to stop the freezing night air from entering. This was their top priority for survival. On October 15th, 1972, the third day after the crash, Numa finally regained consciousness. He asked weakly, "What happened?" Roberto gave a short answer. "The plane crashed." Hearing this, Numa's world shattered. He asked, "How many days have we been stuck here?" Roberto replied, "3 days." Roberto had made a small reflector from a piece of the plane's aluminum. He was slowly trying to melt snow using sunlight. It was a very slow and difficult job, but necessary. Eating snow directly drains the body's heat, which in a place like this is like killing yourself. The water from melted snow was just as precious as food. Meanwhile, the others joined suitcases together and made a large cross on the snow so that if any plane flew overhead, it would see the signal for help. At the same time, the sound of another airplane engine was heard again. Everyone started shouting like crazy and waving their hands. Some tried to attract the pilot's attention by reflecting sunlight with pieces of glass. Some began crying with joy. Others hugged each other in celebration. They thought the rescue team had finally arrived. But slowly the engine's sound faded away. The plane neither landed, nor dropped anything, nor gave any signal. It simply flew over them and disappeared between the mountains. Night fell again. The injured were carefully carried inside the reinforced cabin. Roberto was giving instructions on where to place the injured and repeatedly reminding everyone to be careful with his broken leg so he could rest as much as possible. But in that environment, rest was nothing more than a dream. The next day, the sound of an airplane engine was heard once more. Everyone held their breath and listened carefully. The sound seemed to be getting closer, as if circling nearby. But when they looked up, the plane was nowhere to be seen in the thick clouds. Some people tried to reason with the group. They said the Andes are huge, so the rescue team couldn't search the entire area at once. They must be searching different sections one by one. Yesterday, the rescue plane had flown right over them, and everyone had seen it. Today, they could only hear the sound but not see the plane, which meant the rescue team was searching somewhere else. Finally, Marcelo said firmly that the rescue team would definitely come for them. But when Marcelo left, Fido and Roberto had to face the harsh truth. Fido said clearly that if things continued like this, they wouldn't last many more days. Someone suggested they should climb up to the crash site and search for the tail section of the plane. If they could retrieve the batteries and restart the radio, they could send a signal to the outside world for help. This plan reignited hope in everyone's hearts. Instead of just waiting for the rescue team to find them, this was the only way they could try to do something themselves. The next day, those whose health was relatively better quickly made simple sunglasses. Without them, the intense glare from the snow could cause snow blindness. Then they set out, climbing the snowy slope in search of the tail section. At nearly 4,000 meters, the oxygen level is only about 60% of what it is at sea level. Every step became extremely difficult. They were breathing heavily, their hearts were pounding, and their legs felt incredibly heavy. After just a few meters, they had to stop and rest. But when they reached halfway up the mountain and looked back down, everyone was stunned. From that height, the white fuselage had almost completely blended into the snow. If someone didn't already know it was there, it would be almost impossible to spot. From the air, finding it would be even harder. The moment they realized this, it felt like a knife had been driven into everyone's heart. At that very moment, another rescue plane flew overhead. The pilots searched carefully, but still couldn't see them. They were like a single grain of sand that had fallen into the ocean and disappeared completely. Suddenly, a loud rumbling sound came from a distant slope. It was an avalanche. The 4 men immediately turned and ran back. They didn't dare go any further. They had found nothing, and hope was shattered once again. Time passed, and the 6th day arrived. They had shared their last bit of food, 1 packet of biscuits. Now they had nothing left. Fido and Roberto were sitting on the ground talking. Fido said that Nando had gone crazy, but Nando calmly replied that he would not die of hunger here. If necessary, he would even eat the bodies. Roberto listened silently. Both understood what that meant, but no one had the courage to say it openly. Fido continued. If they were to be rescued, they had to stay alive, and to stay alive, they needed food. Marcelo asked the difficult question with great effort. What'll we eat now? Nando answered in a calm voice. There is food outside. As soon as he said that, complete silence fell inside the cabin. Everyone understood whose bodies he was talking about. Outside, lying neatly on the snow, were the bodies of the people who, just a few days ago, had been their friends, teammates, and family. This suggestion was like breaking the greatest taboo in human civilization. For thousands of years, eating human flesh has been considered an unforgivable crime, the line between human and animal. But now that very line stood before them. If they crossed it, they might survive. If they didn't, death was certain. Roberto calmly explained the effects of hunger on the body. When a person stops eating, the body slowly begins to dry up like a dying plant. The brain stops functioning properly because it also becomes weak. Marcelo asked the most important question. If they really did this, what would happen? Would God forgive them? Roberto said that perhaps God had brought them to this situation, so he would understand they had no choice but to survive. But Fido interrupted him and said there was no hand of God in this. What brought them here was only fate. Arturo tried to explain it logically. He said it was just meat. But Marcelo replied with pain in his voice that it was the flesh of their own loved ones. Roy also supported the idea. He said they should eat it, but they had no right to do so. Roberto countered, "Don't I have the right to do everything possible to stay alive? Who can take that right away from me?" Hearing this question, everyone fell silent. Then the sound of crying filled the cabin. This topic was breaking everyone's heart. They had to choose between morality and survival. Outside, the freezing wind howled loudly, as if mocking their situation. The agony of hunger had become so severe that some people began trying to eat anything they could put in their mouths. They searched through their bags and suitcases. Someone was chewing leather shoelaces. Someone tried to swallow tobacco. But none of these things could be digested. Instead, they caused even more stomach pain. Then another terrifying sign appeared. Many people noticed that the color of their urine had become dark brown. For some, it had almost turned black. This meant their kidneys were starting to fail. Their blood was filling with toxic substances produced by their own breaking down tissues. If this continued, their organs would soon stop working completely. Some people were tightening their belts to press on their stomachs. But they realized there were no more holes left to tighten them. They had lost so much weight that the belts, which once fit perfectly, now hung loosely on their bodies. At night, Nando's sister Susie began struggling to breathe. Nando sensed something was wrong. He called her name, but Susie gave no answer. Her breathing had stopped. In just 3 days, Nando had lost both his mother and his sister. When his father had seen them off, he had asked Nando to take care of them. Now that promise had become one he could never fulfill, a wound that would remain forever. But this loss also awakened something else inside Nando, an incredibly strong, almost insane will to live. He could not let his father lose his entire family. He had to return alive at any cost, no matter what he had to do to get out of this cursed mountain. After Susie's death, the number of survivors dropped to 27. When the plane crashed, there were 45 people. Now only 27 remained. In just 9 days, 18 lives had been lost. On October 21st, 1972, the 9th day, everyone inside the cabin was trembling. No one knew if it was from the cold or from fear. After a night of silence, crying, and inner struggle, the silence was finally broken. One by one, the survivors began giving their consent. Taking this decision was not easy at all. Everyone's voice was shaking, but they knew they had to make a decision. In this way, they found a kind of solution to this moral dilemma. They also decided that if any of them died in the future, their body could be used to keep the others alive. This might not completely erase the guilt, but at least the survivors could find some relief in their minds. Once again, a long silence fell inside the cabin. Giving permission was one thing. Actually doing it was something completely different. The question was, who would do this work and how? Finally, a few people stepped forward. They went outside the cabin and approached the bodies lying on the snow. Those still inside the cabin watched through the broken window. They saw the men outside bending over the bodies with pieces of broken glass in their hands. With great hesitation and reluctance, they did the work that no one even wanted to talk about. Then the men outside put that flesh into their mouths. Seeing the scene, some people inside immediately turned their faces away. Some began to pray. Some cried silently. But others stood up and, after hesitating for a while, slowly began to go outside. Disgust gradually gave way to fear, and the instinct to survive proved stronger than moral rules. Once the first person crossed that threshold, it became a little easier for the rest to follow. Not because the guilt had decreased, but because they were no longer carrying the burden alone. However, Captain Marcelo, Numa, and a few others remained seated inside. For them, this line had still not been crossed. Perhaps because of their faith, perhaps because of their moral principles, or perhaps because they had not yet reached that point of desperation. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. When their bodies became even weaker and death came closer, this last wall would also break one day. Those who had gone outside and those who remained inside understood each other in silence. No one had the right to accuse anyone else, because everyone was trying, in their own way, to preserve whatever humanity was left inside them in this hellish situation. After the 10th day, once this taboo had been broken, it became necessary to organize the survival efforts more systematically. Strauch's cousin took over the task that no one wanted to do, cutting and preparing the bodies. Fido decided which bodies would be used. His rule was to choose bodies of people who had no close relatives in the group, so that the mental burden on others would be slightly reduced. They performed this work far from the cabin, hidden from everyone's eyes, so that the rest would not be mentally broken. If everyone had been forced to watch the full scene, many people's minds would have completely shattered. During this time, someone found a radio in the wreckage. After fixing it, faint voices and unclear human speech could be heard from it. Inside the cabin, Panchito gave Numa a small clot of blood with a piece of meat inside it. He said it would be easier to swallow with the frozen blood, but Numa refused to take it. Panchito sighed deeply. He understood Numa's inner struggle, but he also knew that if Numa didn't eat anything, it meant certain death. Suddenly, devastating news came from outside. Their search had been called off. Upon hearing this, everyone's last hope was shattered. They were still alive. They were still here, but the outside world had already declared them dead. And the cruelest part was that even if a rescue happened, it would not be until next summer. By then, they would have either frozen to death or died of starvation. When Marcelo heard this news, he looked at those who had still not eaten any human flesh. In a trembling voice, he said, "I made a mistake." He admitted that telling everyone to wait for rescue had been his fault. But if he could ask for one last thing, he begged everyone to start eating. As a captain, this was the most difficult moment of Marcelo's life. He had told everyone to wait for rescue. He had believed God would save them, but now even he had to face reality. However, Numa did not give up. He and 2 other men decided to climb the mountain again to search for the tail section. They told no one and made no special plan. They only knew they had to find the batteries so the radio could work again. If they could find the tail and restart the radio, perhaps they wouldn't have to take that forbidden step. The 3 men struggled forward over the snow-covered ground, breathing heavily. After crossing one mountain, they finally saw some pieces of the plane. There were also some bodies lying on the snow, those who had been thrown far away when the tail broke off. Then one companion reminded everyone that the sun was about to set and they should return. But Numa refused. He thought that since they had found these pieces, the tail section must be nearby, so they should continue the search. As night fell, the situation became even more dangerous. They could no longer move forward. Strong stormy winds were blowing, and the temperature suddenly dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Numa told everyone to sit very close to each other. The 3 men held each other tightly and shivered in the deadly cold. They had no sleeping bags or tent. They were fighting death with only the slight warmth of their bodies. This was the greatest test of human endurance. The next morning, all 3 somehow survived. Their entire bodies were numb and extremely weak, but they were still alive. However, they had not found the tail section or the batteries. Their last hope was shattered once again. They returned to the camp. Nando asked Numa what he had seen from above. Numa remained silent for a while, then replied, "Just snow and mountains as far as the eye can see." Hearing this answer, everyone's last hope was broken. They were trapped in the loneliest place in the world, surrounded by endless snowy mountains. But Nando said in a firm voice, "The way out is beyond that mountain. We have to reach there." Then he looked at Numa seriously and said, "You will have to eat, Numa. Otherwise, you won't be able to cross that mountain with me." Someone lit a lighter for a little light. The survivors began calling out their names one by one, but Captain Marcelo gave no response. An avalanche had taken the lives of 8 people. Coco, who had been reciting poetry while remembering his mother just hours earlier, was gone. Captain Marcelo, who had always kept the team together and given them hope, was also gone. After the avalanche, only 19 people remained. More than half were gone. No one knew how much time had passed. Finally, a faint light began to enter through a small hole. In the darkness, that light seemed extremely precious. Someone, seeing the light, tried to express hope that if light was coming in, they were not buried too deep. Then someone asked the question that was in everyone's mind: how long would they have to stay here? The answer was helpless. They could not go outside until the snowstorm ended. After being trapped for 2 days, the hunger had become unbearable. Roberto finally broke the silence. He asked, "What do we do now? Are we just going to sit here?" Hearing this question, everyone fell into even deeper silence. They all understood what Roberto was talking about, but no one had the courage to speak the first word. Gustavo took a deep breath and finally said it. If they wanted to stay alive, they had to eat. Everyone's breath trembled. Finally, Gustavo turned and began the work. He cut a piece of flesh, but no one had the courage to reach out and take it. Gustavo asked angrily whether, after surviving so many hardships, they were now going to let themselves die. His words hit like a hard slap and woke up those who were still hesitating. Finally, one man picked up the flesh and put it in his mouth. Then another. But this time it was different. Previously, they had been using the bodies of people who had no family members present, people who were somewhat strangers to them. But now they were eating the flesh of their own friends, of the same companions who had been sitting with them reciting poetry just hours earlier. This time the guilt and pain were far deeper than before. Every bite felt like a betrayal of friendship. Every swallow felt like crushing their own humanity. But they had no other choice. If they didn't eat, they would die. Suddenly, Numa began shouting angrily. He started digging the snow frantically with his hands. Others tried to calm him down, but Numa wouldn't stop. He kept digging the snow above, hitting it with a pole. With every strike, he was releasing all his anger, fear, and despair. On the 4th day of being buried, Numa was still digging. He did not accept stopping even for a moment. Then suddenly, a ray of light shone through the darkness. One by one, people began emerging from under the snow. Their eyes squinted in the bright light because they had been in darkness for so many days. In reality, everyone's life had been saved by Numa's stubbornness. If he had given up like the others and drowned in despair, all 19 people would have died under the snow. But he didn't. He dug continuously for 4 days and 4 nights and created a way out for everyone. After that, everyone started digging the snow together to find the buried supplies. They were now gaining strength from each other's sacrifice, courage, and unity. Roberto's medical knowledge, Nando's courage, Fido's care. This light of humanity had now become like a new god for them. And the bodies of the friends who had died had given the rest a chance to live. So they too had become part of this new faith. Some time later, Nando suggested that they should leave now. He said, "Look how good the sun is. This is the right time to start the journey." But Roberto felt they were not ready yet. He said they should wait a little longer until the weather got a bit warmer. They could not spend the night outside. The previous experience of Numa and his companions was proof of that. Pedro also explained that after November 15th, the snow would start melting. As the temperature rose, the risk of storms would also decrease. Finally, Nando had to compromise. Between the third and fourth day, layers of snow began to melt. The sound of dripping water could be heard in some places. This was a sign that spring was coming. Gustavo and Roberto were taking care of Arturo. They lifted him very carefully, supporting his head and moving him gently. Arturo was groaning in pain and coughing in a very weak voice. When they gently lifted his clothes, what they saw broke their hearts. Large maggots had appeared on Arturo's back. His skin had turned blue-black and was rotting, and in some places the flesh had completely decayed. Because he had been lying for a long time on the cold, hard metal structure of the plane, and due to severe malnutrition, his body had begun breaking down from the inside. Gustavo said in a serious voice that Arturo's condition was very bad. He probably wouldn't survive more than 3 days. Basco asked Roberto what he thought. Roberto didn't understand what he was asking. Gustavo remained silent for a few moments and then finally said what he really meant. Even though he was a doctor, there was nothing they could do here. If they stayed, they would no longer be doctors saving lives, but grave diggers burying their companions. Gustavo's words revealed a harsh truth. There were no medicines, no equipment, and no warm room where patients could be treated. If they stayed, they would only watch their companions die one by one, and then bury them in the snow. Now there was only one hope left, that someone could get out and bring help. And the strongest body in the team belonged to Roberto. So this responsibility had to be taken by him. A short while later, Arturo stopped breathing. His death shocked everyone. Time was running out. If they didn't do something soon, everyone else would die like Arturo. They would not die from the plane crash or from bleeding, but slowly from weakness and infection. Roberto now understood Gustavo's point. As the strongest member of the team, he could no longer delay. Nando also understood this. No matter how much preparation they made, if everyone died, the preparation would mean nothing. They had to leave, whether they were fully prepared or not, no matter how much danger lay ahead. The next day, Numa, Nando, and 2 others got ready. They decided to head east toward Argentina. They wore as many warm clothes as possible so they could spend one night outside. The 4 men struggled forward over the snowy ground, breathing heavily. Every step required great effort. Because of the thin air, they had to stop and rest again and again. Suddenly, Numa lost his balance and rolled down the snowy slope. Roberto ran to him and checked his leg. The wound was already infected. Roberto decided to take Numa back to the camp, but Numa refused. He said he could go back by himself. Numa did not want to become a burden on the others. He knew that if Roberto went back to drop him off, only 2 people would be left on the expedition and the chances of success would become very low. Roberto was the strongest member of the team, so it was essential for him to stay on the expedition. Numa's decision was a kind of sacrifice. Through his sacrifice, he wanted to give the expedition a small chance of success. Roberto hesitated for a few moments, but finally nodded. He knew Numa was right. Numa turned and walked back toward the camp alone with great difficulty. When he reached the camp, he saw that another survivor had died. Now the 19 had become 18. Numa sank into deep despair. He told Javier that he didn't understand. From the very first moment of the plane crash, he had been trying to help everyone. He had always tried to do the right thing. But now his leg was in this condition, and he had become useless. Javier looked at Numa and said that his wound did not make him useless. Using his own experience of losing his wife, Javier answered Numa's question. Death in itself has no meaning, but those who remain alive give it meaning. Liliana's death had taught Javier the true value of love and had given him a reason to live for his children. Similarly, Numa's injury did not make him useless, but gave him the opportunity to contribute in another way. Everyone has their own mission, and not everyone has to climb the same mountain. Some time later, Nando and the others returned. Nando excitedly told Numa that they had walked east for about 2 or 3 hours. Suddenly, behind a small hill, they had found the tail section of the plane. Nando could hardly believe it. That part of the plane had broken off during the crash and fallen to the other side. Inside it were many scattered suitcases. clean jackets, alcohol, cigarettes, and chocolate. Nando gave Numa some chocolate. Numa immediately tore it open and began eating as if he wanted to swallow the wrapper too. Nando admitted that Numa had been right earlier. They had spent one night outside and had almost died. But the battery they needed was found in that same section of the plane. The problem was that the battery was very large and heavy, so bringing it back was not possible. But if they took the radio there, they could try to operate it. Nando also said that Roy had fixed the radio. Roberto believed they could also operate the plane's radio. Nando said they would have to go back to that place and try again. This was a moment when hope was rekindled. If the radio worked and they could send a help message, perhaps they wouldn't have to risk crossing the mountains. Some time later, Nando and 3 others set out again. Numa watched them go. He wished he could go with them, but his body forced him to stay. He could only pray silently for them. Roy finally succeeded in connecting the radio to the battery. Now, everyone began trying different frequencies to operate it. Suddenly, Nando asked, "What if the radio doesn't work?" Roberto replied calmly, "Then we will return and head west toward Chile." A short while later, crackling sounds began coming from the radio. Roberto immediately leaned toward the microphone and spoke. He told them that they were Uruguayans trapped in the Andes Mountains. They were still alive and needed help, but in response, there was only noise. After a while, music and a faint voice could be heard. They realized it was just a normal radio broadcast station. It was not two-way communication. They could hear others, but no one could hear their voice. As the days passed, their physical strength continued to decline. Their food rations were very low, so they began separating meat from bones and eating it. What was once unimaginable had slowly become normal for them. One day, Numa suddenly began to speak. "I am not just 5 years old. I still have a lot to do in my life. I want to go back to my brothers. I want to see my mother and father again. I want to dance. I want to do everything. I want to laugh. I want to cry." The person in front asked with a slight smile, "Have you ever danced?" Numa shook his head and said no, but now he wanted to. He wanted to do everything. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to cry. Then Panchito said softly, "Then cry." Tears began to flow from Numa's eyes. He started crying loudly. Panchito kept saying, "Cry, cry." It was a very human moment. Numa was not giving up. He was expressing his desire for life. His wishes were very simple: to meet his family, to dance, to laugh, to cry. Panchito let him cry so that the pain inside him could come out. In such harsh conditions, crying is not weakness. It is a way to release the accumulated pain so that a person can gather the strength to keep living. Meanwhile, Roy continued working on the radio. He kept trying different frequencies and connections. But in the end, all efforts failed. On November 29, 1972, they had been trapped for 47 days. At that time, 17 people were still alive. Nando and the others returned to the camp exhausted. Everyone immediately asked, "What happened?" Roberto simply said, "The radio is not working." This was a sentence that broke everyone's last hope. Now, they could not contact the outside world. They could not tell anyone that they were still alive. But Tintin gave another piece of news. They had found a waterproof cloth in the tail section. They could make sleeping bags from it. This discovery was very important. Earlier, when Numa and the others had tried to spend a night outside, they had almost died from the cold. It meant that spending the night in the mountains without warm clothes and protection was impossible. But now, if they made sleeping bags from that waterproof cloth, they would have a chance to spend the night outside. This discovery turned the plan to cross the Andes from a mere fantasy into a real possibility. Nando immediately asked, "When are we leaving?" Roberto replied, "As soon as the sleeping bags are ready, we will leave. No more waiting." Meanwhile, a new announcement was heard on the radio. After 78 days of searching, the Air Force had decided to restart the search operation. A special C-47 plane would be sent toward the Andes to look for them. Hearing this news, differences arose in the camp. Roberto believed they should now wait because the rescue team might find them, but Nando strongly opposed it. He said they could not go back to the beginning again. Looking at everyone, he said, "Look at me and look at them. Is this called living? We cannot stay here just praying. Do you really want to sit here sleeping day after day? Days passed. While waiting, everyone's remaining strength was running out. They were waiting for the rescue team, but also waiting for someone to finally make the final decision. During this time, Tintin kept taking pictures with his camera. He captured everyone's face, pictures of the plane wreckage, the snow-covered mountains, and even the bodies lying on the snow. He knew that if they all died here, these pictures would be the only proof that they had once been there. And if they returned alive, these pictures would bear witness to their terrible journey. In either case, these pictures would record the truth that they had been there, that they had struggled, and that they had once been alive. One day, Numa told Nando that he wanted him to know one thing. If necessary, he could use his body. Nando immediately scolded him. "Don't talk such nonsense." But Numa remained calm. He said it was true, but he was fine with it. It gave him peace to know that they would succeed. On December 11th, 1972, Numa passed away peacefully in his sleep. His death was calm, but extremely sad. He was not even a member of the rugby team. Still, he had joined this trip. After the crash, he had tried to help everyone. During the eastward journey, he had been injured and finally died due to infection in the wound and malnutrition. Before dying, he had given Nando permission to use his body. This was his final contribution, helping his friends survive with his own body. Nando took out the paper on which Numa had written his last words. He read it aloud to everyone. It said, "The most sacred love is when someone gives his life for his friends." The next day, they prepared Numa's body according to his wish and packed it as food for the expedition. This was the heaviest and most emotional task for them. Numa had not only inspired Roberto with his death, but had also given his body as the final food for the expedition. In the camp, everyone gathered to bid farewell to the expedition team. Fernando went to Carlos and told him that they could also use the bodies of his mother and Susie. This was his greatest sacrifice. Earlier, he had been ready to risk his life to protect their bodies, but now he had let go of that attachment so that the others could live. This was a sign that he had fully accepted reality. For him, the responsibility toward the living had now become more important than his feelings toward the dead. On December 12th, 1972, the 60th day since the crash, the westward expedition began. The goal was to reach Chile. 3 people set out: Nando, Roberto, and Tintin. The 3 began climbing the mountains westward, breathing heavily. At night, all 3 huddled together in one sleeping bag and spent their first night on the edge of a crevasse. The next day, the 3 continued moving forward in extremely difficult conditions. Finally, they somehow reached the top of the mountain. They were breathing heavily and hoping that once they reached the top, they would see a green valley below with signs of civilization, some settlement, and the end of this terrifying nightmare. But the sight before them broke their hearts. As far as the eye could see, there were only snow-covered mountains, one after another, with no end in sight. The Andes looked like a frozen ocean whose waves rose and fell in the form of mountains, stretching all the way to the horizon. They had thought that crossing just this one mountain would show them the world below. But now they understood that this was only one of countless mountains. They began talking among themselves. "We have already reached that valley. We just have to cross this valley to reach the next one." But what did that mean? A 10-day journey or a 20-day journey? They only had 1 week's worth of food left. Roberto was a rational person. He knew the odds were not in favor of this journey. Food was low, the distance was huge, and their strength was running out. But Nando's determination and faith showed him another possibility. Perhaps there really was a way down between those 2 mountains. Perhaps they could really reach there. And most importantly, if he turned back, Nando would continue alone. Roberto could not leave his friend to die alone. In the end, both decided to continue westward. They decided that Tintin would return to the camp so that the food would last longer. Tintin returned to the camp and told the others about their condition. He said that both Nando and Roberto were fine. They had about 10 days of food and nothing was stopping them. Meanwhile, deep in the Andes, Nando and Roberto continued moving forward. One mountain after another stood before them, covered in clouds and fog. They crossed one valley, then climbed another slope, then crossed the next mountain. Their backs bent, their breath came in gasps, and their hearts pounded as if they would burst out of their chests. But they did not choose to stop. After walking for who knows how long, Nando pointed ahead. Finally, they began to see a path leading downward. As they descended, the altitude decreased and the temperature rose slightly. Their steps became stronger than before. Then suddenly, they heard the sound of birds. This meant they had come down quite far. They also saw some insects, which was a sign that life existed here. On the 9th night, Nando suddenly began vomiting violently. He had a terrible cough. His body was now completely broken. It was as if his body was giving its final warning that they had reached the absolute limit. If they did not find any humans soon, they would really die on the way. But they could not stop. Stopping meant that the companions waiting in the camp would also die. On the 10th day, they found a small stream. This was not melted snow water, but a real flowing river. This meant there was a permanent water source here. In other words, life existed somewhere nearby. Then suddenly Roberto saw a herdsman on the other side of the river. At that moment, both could hardly believe their eyes. After crossing countless mountains for 10 days and enduring unbearable pain, they had finally seen a sign of human civilization. The joy and relief of that moment could not be expressed in words. They cried and shouted for help, but their voices were so weak and hoarse that they could not be heard clearly. The herdsman waited for a while, then threw a stone. A piece of paper and a pen were tied to it. Nando picked up the paper and pen with trembling hands and began to write. His hands were shaking not only from exhaustion and weakness but also from emotion. His handwriting was crooked, but every word was clear and strong. Every word carried the lives of 14 people. Later, this note became a famous document in history, a symbol of the human will to live. The herdsman immediately gave them food and water. Then he rode off on his horse to deliver this astonishing news. Nando and Roberto sat in a wooden hut, feeling the warmth of the sun and listening to the sound of flowing water and birds. It felt as if they had entered another world. They had succeeded. They had truly come out of the mountains. But they knew time was short. Their companions back in the mountains had very little food left. Their condition was also very bad. Every passing day was becoming more dangerous for them. The news quickly reached the Air Rescue Service. The government confirmed their location and immediately sent a rescue team. Shortly afterward, journalists' vehicles also began arriving at the herdsman's house to interview these two miraculous young men. Meanwhile, when the remaining people waiting at the wreckage heard this news on the radio, sounds of joy and crying echoed among them. After 71 days, they had finally seen the moment they had been waiting for. Helicopters began flying toward the snowy mountains to pick up those who had been waiting for 71 days. The terrifying nightmare was finally about to end. While waiting for rescue, they hugged each other and gave each other courage. Some were cutting their hair, some were shaving their beards so they could look like human beings again. A short while later, the helicopters arrived. At that moment, all their strength broke. Dozens of thin, weak young men held each other and began crying loudly. They had survived. They had finally survived. The plane had crashed on October 13th, and they were rescued on December 22nd. 45 people had boarded the plane, but only 16 returned alive. They had endured the most difficult survival test in human history, -40°C cold, lack of oxygen at high altitude, hunger, avalanches, illnesses, and even more difficult moral struggles. But they survived. This was not a miracle or luck. It was because of the sacrifices, help, and courage they showed for each other. Roberto's medical knowledge saved the lives of the injured. Some people's courage helped manage the dead bodies. Nando's willpower helped them cross the Andes. Someone saved their friends' lives despite their own wounds. Every living person carried the burden of those dead companions with them, and that burden would always remind them of what had happened on that mountain. In the hospital, the survivors received full treatment. Their average weight had dropped by more than 30 kilograms. Some people's weight had fallen to just 40 kilograms, which is less than half of a normal adult male. They suffered from severe malnutrition, cold injuries, infections, and bone fractures. Everyone had various health problems, but the miracle was that they were all alive. Even the doctors were amazed at how the human body could survive such harsh conditions for so long. Meeting their families was a moment filled with joy and tears. Some fathers hugged their sons and cried. Someone had kept his promise and returned alive, although his mother and sister remained forever on that mountain. His father told him that returning alive was the greatest victory, and his mother and sister would have wanted him to live a good life. The other survivors also met their families. The media from all over the world arrived to cover this miraculous story. But along with it, a sensitive question also arose. What exactly had they eaten on the mountain? Finally, under heavy pressure, they had to tell the truth. When, in the press conference, Roberto admitted that they had used the bodies of their dead companions to survive, the entire hall fell silent. This was not a conventional story of heroism. It was the story of ordinary people. They were not superheroes, nor saints, nor born warriors. They were just ordinary young men, students, players, friends. They felt fear. They broke down. They cried. They questioned. But they also loved. They supported each other, made sacrifices, and then stood up again. That snowy mountain had seen both the weakness and the greatness of humans. Their decisions had to be made to survive that are difficult even to think about in normal life. But in that same place, humans had also stood by each other, kept hope alive even on the edge of death. When everything is taken away, food, warmth, safety, dignity, then one thing still remains for a human being: the choice to give up or to live, the choice to preserve humanity or to fall, the choice to trust in love or to drown in despair. Those 29 people remained forever on that mountain. Their bodies stayed buried in the snow. Their story lived on in the memories of the survivors, and their souls became part of human history. And the 16 people who came out alive continued to live their entire lives carrying that burden. They knew they were not living just for themselves, but also for those 29 people. This story is not only about survival, but also about humanity. Even in the deepest darkness, a small flame of hope continues to burn. And that mountain in the depths of the Andes still stands today, silently guarding the souls of those 29 and bearing witness to the story that changed the lives of 16 people forever. If you liked today's story, please like the video and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We will meet again with another interesting video.